Now, welcome back to Team 33. So the last couple of weeks we've been looking at football documentaries, and we thought with the week that's in it, we'd take a look at The Boys in Green, the documentary that went out on RTE a couple of weeks ago about Jack Charlton's Ireland team, their journey through Euro 88 and Italia 90 and the World Cup in USA in 94 as well. And I'm joined on the line by Colm Boohig, by Ciaran Bradley and by Paul Moore as well. Lads, how are you getting on?
All good.
Good, man.
Obviously, it's been an emotional week for Irish football fans. I don't know which of you are the oldest. I don't know if I'm allowed to ask that, but I'll throw this to Colm first. Would you remember?
That's not true, fuck's sake.
Do you remember watching Jack Charlton's Ireland? Were you old enough to do that? Is that a fair question? Am I completely insulting you in your elder years?
Yeah, well, I just celebrated my 21st last night, so I don't really know much about Jack Charlton. No, he was like the grandfather of my childhood, definitely. And I got my earliest recollection of any football at all is USA 94 and Ray Houghton's goal against Italy. And then the rest of it for Euro 88 and Italia 90, you're obviously watching back, but it's probably the highlights against England at Euro 88, for the same match, the Italia 90, and for the Romania penalty shootout and Italy quarter-final. They're probably the highlights that I've watched most out of any football in my whole lifetime. And it went far beyond football, far beyond sport. It was a cultural staple-hold in my childhood, and I think everyone else is over the age of 25 in Ireland. It's very hard to put into words.
Paul, any direct memories of Jack Charlton's era as Ireland boss?
Yeah, well, I'll tell you, my first game I went to see that I remember was a USA 94 warm-up, Ireland against Bolivia. It was 1-0, John Ciaran scored. And I was actually, there's footage of you see the team coming back from Italia 90. I was on the overpass, that's actually in Santry when they're coming back from the airport. Went out, it's about 5 minutes from my family home. I went out to greet them. And in the footage in 94, when they're in the Phoenix Park and Pat Kenny is emceeing the homecoming, I was there as well. So my first memory, I have vague memories of Italia 90 itself, just kind of colours and cheers and celebrations, and my old lad probably jumping around, losing his mind like everyone else in the country. So, but I vividly remember USA 94. In fact, I know exactly where I was for all three games. My folks were even in Giant Stadium, and they were in Florida. So that was the first tournament for me that still vividly I can recall. I remember Germany-Bolivia, the opening game, with that famous Diana Ross penalty before the tournament even started. So that was my first tournament I remember well. And I was lucky enough to grow up, and my first allegiance to the Boys in Green was Charlton side. First game I was, and I can remember even where I was for the match in Anfield in 95. So I have vivid memories of this.
Am I allowed to ask what age you were?
At Anfield, I would have been 9 years old. I'm 86, so I kind of fall nicely into the category of the glory years. Colm, as a young 21-year-old, he's a blow-in. He's probably loyal to the Stan regime, not Jack.
Right, so you would have been peak age really for growing up watching this Ireland side then. And can you remember the carnage in Dublin around that time? Because everyone who was around at that stage talks about it, but obviously a lot of the people of my generation wouldn't have experienced anything like that.
Not so much Italia 90, because I would have been 4, but you see the famous footage of like the Walkinstown roundabout, and it's funny just even seeing like landmarks in Dublin that are still there. Like you've got the water fountain on Dame Street, people still congregate on and jump on, and the O'Connell statue, which is always great. But I do remember 94. It was one of those moments when the buntings were everywhere. One of the rare days, when you get like assemblies in school with people who come in. There was every country, every household in Ireland seemed to have the USA 94 milk bottles. Kellogg's had these commemorative cards that used to come out. I used to collect them. It was just a great time. And oddly, 94 for me, it was the first experience of a World Cup. This is why a World Cup is so good. You see teams that you never heard of, and this was pre-internet and stuff. So, like, the shock of seeing, like, I remember Saudi Arabia, that unbelievable goal, and thinking, like, the quality of football around the world is incredible. And even aside from Ireland in 94, there was so much drama and stories about it. But it's incredible, just the wave of happiness and emotion that can capture a country in those few weeks. And we'll get into Charlton's legacy, but it's just, in simplistic terms, if you're taking away all the tactics and all the football, all the goals, all the controversy, the man just made millions and millions of people happy through his work. And it's something that is extremely rare in Irish society, given the period he started with such a dour time in Irish history.
Yeah, and Ciaran, you're coming at this from a really interesting perspective, because I know you spent a lot of time in England, and was there a feeling around that time, around Jack Charlton? Do you remember the sort of attitude the English public had to him, or would you have been too young at that stage?
Well, I'm the same age as Paul there, and funnily enough, in USA 94 was the first proper tournament I remember really as the first football memory. And for the Italy game, I was over in Ratoath, actually, so I remember watching it with the lads, with my family over there, and going crazy for that. So in terms of how he was viewed in England, I think I would have been a touch too young at that point, but I certainly remember the euphoria around USA 94 over here. And in a weird way, particularly when you watch stuff like this, and I'm researching a piece on Jack for the site as well, you get a very weird nostalgia for a place where you've never been, really, with stuff like the Italia 90. So, yeah, I mean, he was... he's such a universally loved figure. And I suppose actually the crux of the piece I'm doing is that he's equally loved on both sides of the Irish Sea, which is actually something that I can't really recall ever happening with another public figure, particularly in sporting terms. So, it was an amazing time. But in terms of offering a little insight into England, I can't really do that at the minute, I think.
Yeah, well, I do want to touch on the point that you just mentioned there, because I wrote a piece for otbsports.com a few months ago during lockdown it was around the time we were doing the Classic Games Club, and I was on speaking about the Celtic 6-1 game against Rangers. And that game was in 2000, so I was only 5 years old. I don't remember watching it live, but I felt an affiliation with that Celtic team. I felt nostalgic watching it. My emotions were exactly as if I was in the stadium at that point in time, but I was too young to remember it. And I suppose Italia 90 I would have a similar enough feeling towards, because I've seen the Reeling in the Years footage, the footage of the fans on the streets, and it almost feels as if I was at the event that took place 5 years prior to my birth. So that's how big a moment Italia 90 was for Irish football. And USA 94, not so much. It just didn't seem to capture the imaginations the same amount as Italia 90, probably because the team didn't do as well. But Jack Charlton brought something really special to this Irish team. Colm, do you remember that sort of change in attitude between Irish football fans, that we actually could go and do something in the 90s? Like, growing up with this Irish team in the 90s, it must have been such a different thing to what it was, say, for the last 10 years.
Yeah, the previous 10 years, yeah. I mean, because it ended... it was such a damn squid, like if it ends with the Owen Hand rain and 8,000 people showed up for the Denmark game. And Owen Hand tried to play good football, and it just wasn't happening, even though we had good players. And I guess Jack came in in 1986, and what he did, I'm a bit conflicted, because the football wasn't enjoyable to watch, but obviously he has an incredible record. He managed 94 Ireland games, and his win ratio was 50%, and they only conceded 63 goals. It was ridiculous. Like, I mean, how well drilled they were was unbelievable. They were world class in that, and they were sixth in the world at one stage. That's how well drilled they were. But what he did, I think that is slightly underrated, is that he was telling well-established, very talented, high-level players to completely change and disregard their game and play safety-first football, which it's not easy to do, to change the minds of players who are very good and have egos. So I would give him great credit for that. The other side of it, though, is that when he came into the job in 1986, we were at such a low ebb football-wise. We had never qualified for a tournament. And nationally, as a country outside of sport, we were at a low ebb too. I mean, Ireland was, in the mid to late 1980s, was dominated by immigration, recession, the IRA, and the church's grip of the country, and it was pretty grim to look back on. So anything at all that was positive was going to be met with raised eyebrows by a downtrodden country. But I guess without even really actually trying to lift the spirit of anyone in Ireland outside of the players, Jack, through the results that we had in qualifying for Euro 88 and Italia 90, brought the country along with him, and the spirits were raised as a result. And I don't think that will ever be replicated in terms of going from 0 to 90 so quickly. I'm kind of forever grateful for him for that, because I've only known kind of relatively positive times in Ireland. Not because of Jack Charlton, but he played a huge part in that. He's very much in the pro column, let's say.
Yeah, I do want to return to Jack's style of play a little later on, but what I do want to touch on, and it's portrayed throughout this entire two-part documentary series on him, and probably in all of the reports and obituaries and memories that people have been sharing about Jack Charlton over the last week or so, is his personality and how loved he was in this country. Because if you look at the footage, I don't remember in my period of time the manager of Ireland, or any manager in fact in football, having such a relationship with the fans, being amongst the people that much, talking to people on a normal level basis, and just being so accessible to the public. I mean, it's. I know it was a bygone era, and it's part of the 90s, and that's just the way things were. But Paul, I don't think there will be an Irish manager, or maybe even an Irish celebrity, that will have that affiliation with the public the way that Jack Charlton did.
No, and it really come out in the tribute to him that a lot of the players, even if they may have disagreed with the style of football, they would still run through a brick wall from him. And it kind of comes from his background. I mean, he's from a northern mining town, Ashington. He worked in the mines before he went and signed a contract with Leeds at 17. I mean, he is as salt as the earth as you can possibly get. And even coming in, he was very definitive about his ideology about football. I mean, John Giles for years played with him at Leeds his entire career, and he said, I wouldn't have a bad word personally to say against Jack. I'd never fall out with him, but I don't see eye to eye with his football philosophy. But if you look throughout it, I mean, it's not all Jack. Let's face, this was a golden generation of Irish players. And I think Charlton would say he was the first one to say he inherited a very good squad. And when you look back at previous campaigns, particularly the one in Euro 82, Belgium and France, Ireland were victim of a few fairly strange decisions. So, I mean, you do need an element of luck, to succeed, and maybe own hand in an alternate universe would be as revered and loved as Charlton is. But obviously success breeds that bit more love. But I mean, you look at the footage, it was genuinely akin to what you'd see the Beatles with. Charlton was ribbon cuttings, kissing babies, getting free pints. You see him at the opening of the Waterford Crystal Factory. He's the one that's there, and usually that's something that's reserved for Taoiseachs and such. But they just loved him because he was very much what you get. And there's some wonderful anecdotes coming out off the ball. We've had them a few. You see the likes of Graham Souness saying Charlton, even in his younger career as a manager of Middlesbrough, took him aside and was a huge influence on Souness's career. And then you look at what he went on to achieve: 3 European Cups in the game. I mean, these are his impact on players was seismic. And okay, he mightn't have been as tactically nous, which I think is a bit of a cut out as well, because a manager, basically, his job is to look at what he has and get them playing effectively and winning matches. And as Colm alluded to earlier, his win ratio was fantastic. And every player loved coming to play from him. McAteer on off the ball during the week said that the Irish team used to have conversations saying, we used to regularly talk to each other, wouldn't it be great if we were a club team? They said they used to love getting on the plane to Dublin to come over, even if they weren't involved. And John Aldridge had to run his leg to stumps, like he said in the documentary, and that's why he went so long with it to get an international goal, but he still did it because they bought into this system and they bought into the man.
Another thing that was evident in this documentary series, Ciaran, is the cigar smoking manager, and that's something we need more of. If you watch any of his interviews afterwards, he's just there puffing away at his cigar, cool as you like.
Yeah, he's lovely. He's a real throwback, and I'm sure it brings us all back to some element of childhood. We've got like a grandparent or family friend puffing away on a pipe or something. It's mad. But he was an incredibly unique figure, and I think going back to what you were saying about his impact in Ireland at that point, like there were a lot of things going in his favour. So, I mean, we all know, for example, now how small a country Ireland actually is, particularly if you want to escape something that's maybe not in your favour. There's a little bit of a kind of rumour mill and that kind of thing. But like here now, we've got nearly 5 million people in the country. There were 3.5 million at that stage. So it was even that bit smaller. And the fact that the media was all that more concentrated was really in the favour of a manager who not necessarily needed to, but wanted to get across a message to the people. And because he was doing it in such a way that was so everyman and so kind of gruff and straight talking and stuff like that, and it was great. And he had this real little vulnerability. Like during the course of researching this piece, I was looking at the interview he did with Bill O'Herlihy just after the, I think it might have been after the World Cup qualifier with Northern Ireland, but he's talking about his little tete-a-tete with Billy Bingham and how, the line was, I said, up yours as well, Billy, because apparently one of the team had said something to Morris Setters, and he found out subsequently that Billy Bingham had nothing to do with it, and basically he interrupted the press conference that Billy Bingham was having, because this was the last match in charge of Northern Ireland. And he didn't mean to do it in front of the press, but he just went in and said, Billy, I want to apologise. Like I had been sort of given the wrong information and best wishes and all this kind of thing. And I just thought that he has this real kind of vulnerability, this real charm to him that very few public figures I can recall have, actually. So, yeah. He's a real miss, and like it's taken it's taken for me a few days for it to kind of properly sink in a bit too much. But it's a real sad death. It's one of those ones that you're like, oh God, that is a bit of a gut punch, all right.
Yeah. You know what I find so Enda, do you know what I find so compelling about his whole tenure is that, like, you have to consider the time, the mid 1980s to the mid 1990s, that an Englishman became the most popular man in Ireland. And that's a testament to the character that Jack was, because I guess Irish people never saw him as quintessentially English because he wasn't. I mean, there's a video that was up on BBC during the week of a training session that Jack conducts as Middlesbrough manager. And he said that he had a few options when he was considering the Middlesbrough job, and a few abroad that he did consider, but also a few down south that he would never consider because he does never want to live in London, ever. And Irish people just took to his sensibility, as Ciaran was saying there. And Englishness and England dominates as a team in that 10-year period, because you have all the English players that he recruited with the granny rule, and then you have the two England games, a Euro 88 and Italia 90, and then you have the Euro 92 qualifier at Wembley where Jack is booed by the England fans and he mutters, I want a World Cup for this country in the stadium. And then you have the Lansdowne Road friendly in 1995, and it dominates. It's a team throughout the whole tenure. But what is most fascinating for me is that our biggest heroes from that time were English players, or non-Irish players playing for Ireland, Ray Howden, and a manager who was as English as they come, won the World Cup for England, but was the biggest hero in Ireland. And that is amazing. That will never happen again, ever.
Yeah, and I suppose that era throughout Irish history, not only in the football world, is well documented, along with Jack Charlton, as the defining period of Irish history, because you have the New Friday Agreement, the peace in Northern Ireland, you have the country becoming more autonomous from the church, and you also have just this rise of a standard of living, because we escaped one of the worst recessions in history from the 1980s. So it was a defining era for Irish people, and I suppose that's why people remember it so fondly, and maybe Jack goes along with that as well. I do think a little bit too much is made with the correlation between the Irish team and the general good feeling in the country at that stage. I would say that would have been there anyway, but it definitely played a big role in it as well. Another thing that has been attributed to Jack over the last week or so has been his style of play, and I do want to talk about that because that's something that he was vastly criticised for at the time, despite getting good results. He was also criticised for bringing in English players, like you mentioned, Colm, but it was effective, and if anything, it was almost like a beta mode for what we see nowadays with the pressing from the Man City sides and from the Liverpool sides as well. It just wasn't that as developed as those. But, Paul, this style of play was well ahead of its time, maybe even 10, 15 years ahead of where it should have been.
Yeah, Jack went to the 1986 World Cup, and at the time the trend was playmakers, your Cruyff, your Platini's, and he took a contrary view to the game. He said, essentially, people in possession of the ball, particularly midfielders who tend to drop deep and show for the back four to collect the position of the ball, a la your John Giles used to do and Liam Brady for Ireland, comfortable players on the ball are more likely to be dispossessed in dangerous areas and turnovers, and that's where most teams would get their goal from. So his view on international football was very definitive from that period, and he came back and incorporated to Ireland. Now, at the time, we were graced with an abundance of brilliant centre halves: Kevin Moran, Mick McCarthy, Paul McGrath. We had some great players in that sense, but his view was fullbacks get the ball, and as soon as they have it, John Aldridge or one of the strikers would run to the corner, basically occupy defenders, win possession back, and then that would be like, in modern parlance, the first trigger. And then after forward run, second trigger, midfield closes, squeezes the space. And in that third of the opposition half, that's when Ireland would retrieve the ball and they'd have territory and therefore. So there was a method to it. And while if you look at maybe more recent Irish teams, in particular the trap era, when the Euro 2012 I watched them, and that was just aimless long balls into small strikers with no game plan. But this is good delivery. You had fullbacks like Steve Staunton, Chris Hughton. These were diagonals more than long balls. If you understand, like they were with purpose. They were with accuracy. And Ireland had an awful lot of success. And Charlton had the assumption that every international defender, whether it be a centre back or a right back, wanted time on the ball and figured they could pass the ball out. And if you look at a lot of Ireland's games, they were hard to beat. They didn't concede much. They didn't score much. But they were competitive, maybe bar the thumping they got in Lansdowne Road in Spain when they were qualifying for USA 94, which Paul McGrath has a bone to pick because he wanted to play centre half that day and Charlton played him centre midfield. So they were effective. And even if you look at the results, okay, we rode our luck against England in '88 in that Packy Bonner had a good game. Gary Lineker will look back and it won't be his fondest memories of playing for England. But, I mean, one of Ireland's greatest performances was in Russia against USSR in '88. Ireland could get the ball down and play when they wanted to. So, to a certain extent, the players did have it seemed like the players did have an element of freedom to go and play and express themselves. And in the game against the Dutch, when Keefe scored, Ireland were 8 minutes away from qualifying in their first major tournament in a group which contained the two finalists of that tournament. And then I think the main thing, which is to stick to hammer, was the Egypt game, which the Irish players even played themselves. Egypt kind of did an Ireland on Ireland in that they were tough, they were compact, they were tough to beat. And it's in those games, as football fans will know, that's when you want your creative players to go and have some license to play, to express themselves. But the players were so locked into this rigid system that did work for them, that they couldn't pick their brains. But because football moves at such a quick rate, as we see in USA 94, the same tactics that beat Italy and gave us this euphoric moment in our sporting culture were outdated in the sapping heat of Florida against Mexico and the Dutch. And ultimately, by the time you get to 95, that Dutch team at Anfield were 3/4 of that superb Ajax team from the 95-96 team under Louis van Gaal, which reached consecutive Champions finals. Football was just moved past Charlton. But for the periods at his peak, he suited tactics to suit his players, and that's what management is.
Yeah, and the best example you can get of the Jack Charlton tactics was his description on Desert Island Discs with Sue Lawley, where he explains it, and he almost has a tit for tat with her, because she's saying that it's lump it forward and chase after it, and he's saying that it's much more developed than that. There's reasoning behind it, there's thought behind it, and the way he describes it is that one player has a job, and when another player's job is done, then that triggers the other player to do their job. So it's actually a really modern way of thinking, because if you look at Mauricio Pochettino's book, he explains the way that his Tottenham side played, that if the likes of, say, Alderweireld carried the ball out with his right foot, that would trigger a run from Dele Alli in midfield. If he carried it out with his left foot, that would trigger a different run from Son up front. So you're talking about really developed tactics, but at that stage, I suppose, he was so rigid in it. Colm, I know you're a purist. What way do you look at this team? We were obviously quite successful for the time. It can't be underestimated, the sheer breakthrough moment it is for qualifying for your first World Cup ever. So successful in that sense, but style of play, is that something that we look back with regret?
No, not regret. Definitely not, because look at all the good times we had, and it popularised the game in Ireland. Because, like, the other thing as well that we haven't talked about yet is that football, or certainly soccer, as it was definitely called then, was not the most popular sport in the country, and it probably is now. And he played a big part in that because of the results, because it brought people together. But yeah, the football was bad, but that was secondary because we were so successful. As I've already mentioned, we were as high as 6th in the world at one stage, which was an incredible achievement. And then by the time we got to Italia 90, because the first 4 years of his time in charge had gone so well, there was expectation going into Italia 90. And when we drew that first game of Italia 90 against England, there wasn't that much of a surprise. And that's why we were so disappointed with the Egypt performance, because they out-Ireland us. But I don't have much of a problem with it looking back, because first of all, I wasn't around, so it doesn't bother me too much. But secondly, he was brave in a way to go that way. It's probably the only way he knew how to play, Jack Charlton. But if you insist on your team playing like that, where it's not aesthetically pleasing, you have to get the results. Because if you don't get the results, no one's going to tolerate it. So it is brave. He could have played pure football and we could have lost honourably, and he would have been applauded, but he got results. But you can't discard what he didn't do in charge as well, where he completely ignored the League of Ireland. He had no respect for it at all. That's why he went and got so many players from the UK. And then, he completely discarded Liam Brady. I think he took him off in his first game in charge against Wales. And David O'Leary, he didn't want to know anything about, and was forced to bring him back into the team. And then, of course, he's gone down in Irish folklore because of the penalty against Romania, which I think was his first penalty ever. So you have to be balanced with it. And the last great performance that Ireland had was the 1-0 win over Italy at USA 94. And although they did start the Euro 96 qualifying campaign very well, it went quickly downhill after the England friendly and the riot. I think Ireland had to get 6 points from their last 3 games and only got a point, drew away to Liechtenstein, which was an awful result, lost at home to Austria, lost away to Portugal, and then got hammered by the Netherlands. And you look back at the highlights of that game against the Netherlands at Anfield, and as Paul already alluded to, you have this incredibly young and vibrant and fantastic Dutch side. And then you have images of Paul McGrath, Tony Cascarino and John Aldridge looking like they're playing Masters football. Like, they all look like well into their 40s. And our team aged dramatically with Jack. Dramatically. And there was no improvement made for the latter half of his tenure. So you have to be balanced with it. I have no regrets about how they played, because it shaped the happiness of my childhood. That's how strong it was.
Yeah, I think in modern sense, Euro 2016 was as close as we're going to get to the sort of feeling around this Jack Charlton team. Hopefully, we might get a few more memories under Stephen Kenny and playing a different brand of football, but it's definitely the same sort of attitude between the style of play and the results, because at that stage, when Ireland beat Germany, it was not pretty whatsoever. We did not deserve to win that game, but we won it. And the carnage in Dublin that night was as close to I feel I'll ever get to what I saw on Reeling in the Years from Italia 90 and USA 94 in the streets. The streets were full of people. People were hanging out the cars, beeping their horns up until 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning. It was amazing scenes and an amazing feeling. But the style of football didn't match it. And ultimately, like Jack, that was Martin O'Neill's downfall as well. As Ireland manager, the results started to not match up to the style of play. So eventually it had to come to an end. We're running out of time here, lads, but before we go, Ciaran, I want to get your favourite part of this documentary, because there's 2 episodes, 50 minutes long, available on RTE Player. There's so much good stuff in it, but what's kind of the stands out for you?
What stands out for me, I really quite enjoyed, and it's maybe like, look, I mean, we've seen all the Italian 90, the Nation Holds Its Breath, all that kind of stuff. I think for me, I've seen that a lot of times by this stage. The one that I quite enjoyed actually was just getting a little bit under the skin of the likes of Aldridge and McAteer and Cascarino to a lesser extent about why they chose Ireland and the stories of them actually physically choosing Ireland, like Jack being in the players' lounge with McAteer at Bolton, just being like, "You want to play for Ireland, son?" So that was great, and also just and really understanding the buy-in that they felt, and as has been mentioned earlier, McAteer saying, he would have loved this to have been his club side. Like, there was a real kind of band of brothers element to it, and they did care, and particularly people like Aldridge and McAteer, and really any Scousers, to be honest, would have liked the idea of not only playing for Ireland but sticking one up to England. Like there's an apartness to Liverpool as a city that they thrive on, and there's such an Irish kind of umbilical link to the city as well. So I really like that, and that was great. And it's just punctuated by the fact that obviously Cascarino, I don't know if this is an urban legend, just wasn't Irish, just didn't have. He says in the documentary, he's like, my grandfather was from Westport in Mayo, and he'd be the proudest man in the world. Is that true? Because apparently it isn't. Who knows? But yeah, so that was really enjoyable.
Listen, it was the 90s. It was a lawless time. Paul, favourite part of the documentary?
My favourite part is part that's gone down in Irish folklore. It's Mick Byrne, the kid like going, "We'll do them for you today," to the fans, and just that closest of bond between the players and the fans. It's palpable in '88 and '90. The Frank Stapleton's doing an interview, I think, in the tunnel in after the pitch in Stuttgart, and he turns to the fan and goes, "He's all buying a drink tonight." Like that, the level of closeness and access. It seems genuine. You can't fake that enthusiasm and that bond. I mean, you look at nowadays, and I'm not getting nostalgic, or I'm not like back in my old day, but it's just not. It will never be able to be replicated in just the way football moves on, and players are rightfully isolated and protected, and it's far more professional. But just the closeness, the proximity. I mean, there's footage there. You see RT newsreaders. George Hamilton getting champagne poured on top of his head in the post-match interview by David O'Leary. The proximity of fans, even in the hotel lobby, walking around, mingling with the players. I mean, it was just a completely different time. But it's sport that it's sport at what it does best. It lifts you. It makes you happy. It makes you forget about the normality of life. It gives you that lovely escape, and it was just lovely to see at the time that these players took the entire country with them. So, I mean, what else can you ask for?
Yeah, and I think my favourite part was just the old footage of the likes of Bill O'Herlihy, of John Giles in his younger years, of Eamon Dunphy tossing the pen in disgust, and just the different way of life. It just, without feeling, again, overly nostalgic, because obviously there was bad parts of the 90s as well, but this seemed to be the beginning of the increased level of press, of celebrity, but it was just at the nice level where these people were adored by many fans, but they had that connection as well, and it wasn't, there didn't seem to be the same feeling towards that as there is now. We seem to have gone too far with the likes of commercialism, with the likes of celebrity and their status, and it makes me ponder what life could be like if we went back to that. Colm, what favourite part of the documentary?
Just seeing archive footage of what Ireland was like as a country back then was most interesting to me. Like seeing the flights, like the mass emigration, and seeing flights take off from airports and crying families, and it just makes, I don't know why, it just kind of makes you connect more with your country. And then asking my parents, was it really that bad as being portrayed at that time? Hearing their opinions about it as recently as this morning. And then seeing the home parade after Italia 90, and just the whole country just stood still for this homecoming, and we had reached the quarterfinals. It was insane. And also like seeing footage of Dublin 30 years ago, and very little has changed, and it just makes me smile how similar it all looks.
Doesn't make me smile, Colm. Doesn't make me smile.
Well, it's okay for us. We're not Dubs, so we don't have to be ashamed. But it's just how, it's just a throwback to what Ireland was like back then, but at the same time, how similar everything is. And I do agree with you, and I think it was a once-in-a-lifetime period, really, because I just think even with the emergence and dominance of social media, even I think people would have their heads down too much if that happened nowadays. That's no bad thing. You have to move on. It was of its time, and I loved going back into that time. Yeah, but I'm happy as well. I'm happy that we are where we are too.
Without sounding too old man about it, if this was happening now, what you would be seeing in the crowd is not people up on everyone's shoulders and singing and laughing and enjoying themselves. It would be people filming everyone enjoying themselves. It would be a completely different experience, and maybe it would be as enjoyable as it was back then. But I suppose what's in the past is in the past.
The likes of us wouldn't be able to enjoy it because we'd be trying to get that footage and get it online, and we'd be, we have to get this great UGC out there. And I guess that it has become more business. Like I think we were like a naive, relatively newly established independent country back then, and everything was so new and fresh, and everything was good. And we're probably more cynical now because we expect more of it. But we expect higher standards now because of the Jack Charlton era.
I'm going to hold that against you anytime you ask me to film something while I'm out enjoying myself now over the next couple of years when Stephen Kenny's in charge of Ireland. Hopefully we might see a bit more of this. But that is all we have time for on this segment. Anyway, lads, thanks very much for joining me today.
Thanks.
Pleasure.
We'll take a quick break.